Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the War of the Rebellion podcast. I'm your host, Niels Eichhorn from beautiful spring weather North Germany today. And I have a rather interesting book today that we're going to talk about. Eric, my guest, reached out to me out of the blue and was like, hey, I have this new biography that came out. Would you be interested? And I was like, yeah, send me a copy. Let's see. And it was a great read on a 10-hour flight to the United States. So I might have missed one or two things being zoned out, but I think I got most of the stuff. But Eric, first of all, Eric Smith, our guest today, is an associate professor of church history at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And I think this is the first time I have actually a guest from a seminary on the podcast. He also has a PhD from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary and is the author of quite a few books. And it seems like you like biography. He also wrote John Leland, a Jeffersonian Baptist in Early America, and Oliver Hart and the Rise of Baptist America. But today we are going to talk about the newest book published by LSU Press, which is Between Worlds, John A. Broadus, the Southern Baptist Seminary, and the Prospect of the New South. Well, so thank you so much, Eric, for joining and reaching out to let me read your fascinating new biography.
Well, thank you very much, Niels. It's my honor to be here with you, and thank you for reading the book.
Well, my pleasure. So you wrote a biography about the second president of your seminary. So it's an interesting choice. So why did you feel that Broadus needed a biography?
Yeah, it's a great question. John Broadus was a significant figure in the American South in the latter half of the 19th century. He's a massive figure on the religious landscape. He was a beloved, popular preacher both in the South and in the North after the Civil War. He was actually very involved in just the events that would shape the post-Civil War South. He was a very well-known figure. He's the author of the most popular preaching textbook in American history. So he's had a wide-reaching influence in America and beyond there. And he's also one of the co-founders of what's today one of the largest evangelical seminaries in the world, the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And so a very significant figure who has never received a full treatment from a critical biographer. There's a life and letters of Broadus that his own son-in-law produced in around 1901, so shortly after Broadus's death in 1895. And that's useful for researchers, and it's a good starting point. But there was no updated biography on Broadus, and I've just been drawn to him for years. I was a student at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and then now that I'm a member of the faculty, he continues to have something of a shaping influence on that institution. Just wanted to know more about him, and I saw that there was a bit of a gap in the literature, and so I decided to dive in.
So did you feel like he was watching over your shoulder when you were writing?
Well, if you walk around the halls of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, there are several signs of Broadus's influence still. There's some portraits on the wall. There's a beautiful chapel that is modeled after the First Baptist Church in America, which would be the Providence, Rhode Island Baptist Church. It's got the tall, elevated steeple that you have to walk up some stairs to get into. The pews have doors on them, and it's very lovely, but it's called the Broadus Chapel. And I've actually participated in a wedding in that chapel before. Just there's lots and lots of Broadus history there at the seminary. And he's also been a figure of some controversy in the last 10 years as there's been a return to this discussion in American public life about the appropriateness of memorializing those who were complicit in Southern slavery, those who held white supremacist views in the late 19th
Mhm.
century, and Broadus has fallen under the disapproval of many, and there have been calls to kind of remove Broadus's name and his influence from Southern Baptist institutions and other places. And so I thought for some contemporary reasons, it would be a good time to reckon with his legacy.
Yeah, no, good. And when you read the biography, I mean, obviously there's sort of when you start, right? It's like the professor at the institution where Broadus was, writing about Broadus, and is a person that works at a theological institution, writing about a theologian. You know, you kind of get a little bit initially sort of a moment where you're like, ooh, what should I expect? Is this sort of a old-fashioned like biography? But you're very critical in a number of places with things that he has done.
Well, I certainly did not mean it to be like a public relations piece for John Broadus. I also did not intend to write a cynical biography. So I'm trying to steer between total cynicism, as if he has nothing to offer and made no contributions just because of some failures that we can see from our vantage point now. Also, wasn't trying to write a celebratory biography that's the term that we use in my circles is a hagiography, just like a life of the saints kind of a thing, as if he had no flaws, just this sort of stained glass figure. Because neither of those kinds of treatments are all that helpful. And what I hope to do is just write an honest biography that looks at his life as a whole, both the virtues and the failures, the contributions that he has left behind, some of the more regrettable aspects of his thought. I wanted to look at all of it as a whole, and because I think that's the best kind of history. It's the kind that can actually teach us something. We can learn from it. We can grow from it. So I tried not to shrink back from the less pleasant aspects of his life, but I also wasn't tried not to be shy about pointing out some of the helpful things that he said and did.
Yeah, no, and sorry, I really liked how I think it's the end of the introduction where I'm not sure, I wrote this in my email, but I'm not sure if I paraphrased you or quoted you there. But you kind of said something along the lines that the purpose of the book is not to praise or bury Broadus, but gain a better understanding of a historic figure. And that really struck me, because I think that oftentimes we kind of look at a biography and we look at a historic figure because we want to learn something and not just study them because they can offer us sort of a better view of the time period that they're in.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you for saying that. Broadus himself, I think, knew that some of the positions he had taken were not only were controversial in his day, and would continue to be even more so by those who evaluated him later on. And so he even made a statement in the 1890s, just before his death, hoping that even those who most strongly condemn the views entertained by himself and his fellow Confederates would, quote, care enough for historical truth and personal justice to take pains towards understanding our position. I do think there's a difference in approving or commending a position and just understanding it. And that's really what I hope to do is understand Broadus in his own context, in his own times, not to praise him, not to bury him, but just to understand him. And because then we really have a chance to mature and to grow in our own time.
And this sort of like I have to say that I'm not familiar with some of the other individuals that you wrote about, but you have done quite a few biographies at this stage. So do you find biography is a genre that you enjoy? Is it something that you are like, I mean, these are not these top level like A-list characters, right? Like the George Washingtons or Jeffersons. They're A-list characters maybe in Baptist history, but what attracts you to biography especially?
Well, just personally, I've always been drawn to biographies. I can remember as a child loving to read the biographies of the American presidents, or American athletes, or cultural figures or whatever. Since I was a child, I've loved biographies. I just find people's lives to be endlessly interesting, fascinating. And so it's been a lot of fun for me to try my hand at writing biography and using the biography of one particular individual to serve as something of a window into the larger times and historical context. And so the other books you mentioned that I've written, I've sort of been following a chronological march through Baptist history, at least. So that my first book examined 18th century Baptist life through the lens of a man named Oliver Hart, who's a South Carolina pastor, and then move forward into kind of the early Republic period through the life of a man named John Leland, who was very influential during the time of the American founding and outspoken advocate for religious freedom and the separation of church and state. Leland dies in around 1840. And so I wanted to move forward in American history. And Broadus is someone who helps us explore the antebellum Baptist situation, Baptist during the Civil War, Baptist in Reconstruction, Baptist moving into the Gilded Age, and right up to the Progressive era. And so that's another reason why I wanted to study Broadus. He kind of allowed me to explore a part of the Baptist story that I hadn't gotten to yet.
Dare I ask, who's next?
Oh, thanks for your interest. Yeah, I'm really interested in a figure who happens to be another president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Okay. His name's Edgar Young Mullins, E.Y. Mullins, who's regarded by any historian who's going to deal with religion in the South, in the progressive era, into the kind of fundamentalist, modernist controversy of the 1920s. Everyone's going to talk about Mullins. He cast a huge shadow in Baptist life and really an important figure on the whole American religious landscape in the early 20th century. And so Mullins dies around 1928, right before the stock market crash, the Great Depression. And so I'm eager. I'm already have begun some research into Mullins and thinking about his life.
Well, I think you have also the research right next to you, so that helps in that you can easily get to some of the material you need.
That's right. There are a wealth of resources at the Library and Archives at Southern Seminary in Louisville. There's a wonderful archives located in Nashville, Southern Baptist Historical Library and Archives. And so really grateful for so many archivists and librarians who've been helpful in obtaining resources for me.
Nice. But speaking of resources, one of the challenges that at least I did mini biographies in my first book, so it wasn't full scale because I kind of wanted something very specific about them. But one of the things that I found most frustrating usually when I try to do biographical sketches was there's always a period that you don't have information about. Was there any moment when you researched Broadus where you kind of felt like, I would have loved to have more information, more writing, more something from him or his family?
Yes. Now, I will say that of all the figures who I've tried to write about, Broadus has had the greatest wealth of resources. There are just copious files of his correspondences and his notes and all these kinds of things. So to a far greater degree than, say, John Leland or Oliver Hart, many of whose writings have been destroyed, lost, were never kept, or whatever. There's a great cache of Broadus materials. So I felt like he's been the most 3D figure for me. Right. And so I really enjoyed that. But certainly there are some periods where he at least did not keep a record of the things that I was most interested in. There's a period of time in the 1870s in Reconstruction, Greenville, South Carolina, before the seminary relocates to Louisville. The chairman of the faculty, James P. Boyce, is often away doing some frantic fundraising for the institution to keep it afloat after the war. And Broadus is really in charge of the faculty. And it's during that time period that a massive theological controversy begins to develop in the institution surrounding a figure named Crawford Toy. And there are a lot of questions that I have about Broadus's own theological positions, his relationship with Toy during that particular period. And perhaps perhaps there's a reason why that material
Mm,
hasn't left behind. I don't know if it was sort of discarded
mm,
later when Toy became such a controversial figure.
mm,
I would love to know more about that. That's the one area I'd love to tap into a
yeah.
little bit.
Yeah, no, I look forward to actually talk later about him because that section in the book was really interesting, and I kind of felt because as I mentioned before we started, I'm not a very religious person, but I've read quite a bit on Christianity and sort of Jesus history, and obviously what interested me was toys, and was sort of like how he had that conversation coming out of Germany that they were being part of. Let's not get into it too yet, because I I think we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, because after all we have to bring Broadus to that moment in time a little bit. Um, so you you are able to kind of really get into his childhood too, and it almost feels like reading through that first chapter that becoming a figure in the Baptist church was almost put into his cradle.
Yes. So Broadus is born in Culpeper, Virginia, January 24th, 1827. So the antebellum period. And he's born into a family that you might describe as kind of middling gentry. These are not fabulously wealthy people. These aren't the famous FFVs, the first families of Virginia, but they
Mm-hmm.
are people of substance, of public service. So there are many Baptist preachers of some renown in his family who are highly respected and sought after and so forth. And his father is a state politician. He served in the Virginia House for many years, for more than a decade. And he was a Whig politician. And in a highly Democratic area, his father never lost an election. And I think that Broadus grows up around public figures, people who spoke for a living and held crowds sort of spellbound by their
Mm-hmm.
oratory, or had to develop inner relational
Mm-hmm.
skills that would win people over to their position. I think that was just the air that he breathed from
Mm-hmm.
the time of his birth, and that influences him very much as he enters into adolescence. It never really occurred to him to not seek after eminence. He had a passion to be eminent, to leave a mark on the world. He had a certain ambition about him that follows him throughout his life, and part of that is just the company that he was keeping from the time that he was a child. And to me, one of the interesting dynamics of Broadus's life is the way that he seeks to balance in his personal life both the drive to be eminent, to be known, to be famous, to be significant, with the evangelical Christian commitment, which he also deeply embraces, to pursue humility, to surrender his will to the will of God, to be a servant to other people. Those values are sometimes competing values within his own heart, and he's aware of it and talks about it. But that inner conflict never really goes away, I don't think.
Well, he starts, it seemed like, again, this was reading on a plane.
Sure.
It seemed like he was very early on trying his hand with sort of speaking in church too. That this was something he started to develop before he even got enrolled in the University of Virginia.
Yes, so there are records of his father out on the campaign trail. Little John Broadus is with him.
Oh yes,
Maybe
he memorized the speech, right? I
that's
remember
right. He's
now.
practicing his father's speeches at home. He's reading
Mm,
aloud to guests from the state Baptist newspaper or whatever. And at one point, his father loses his voice out on the campaign trail. And so he has his little son, John, stand up and deliver the speech for him. It's his first public speaking opportunity. And we do know that his father did not lose that election. So however much his son's speech contributed to that, we can only speculate. But I do think there was almost an unspoken expectation from the beginning. This is not someone who is going to be content um, simply working with his hands on a farm in obscurity.
Mm,
He's There's almost an expectation for him to do something in
mm,
public life that's going to involve leaving the farm, attending university, pursuing learning. His family, again, was not in that upper echelon of Virginia aristocrats, but they valued learning. They valued um, kind of genteel manners. They did not own massive plantations, but they were masters of a staff of slaves.
mm,
And so there was a certain cultural expectation that he was going to be a public figure of significance. And I think he felt a little of that pressure and
mhm.
early on and pursued it.
Yeah, and I think that pressure too, when you get to this chapter on when he enrolls into the University of Virginia, it sort of really starts to come home, right? That his dad is managing one of the dormitories, and he is there on a scholarship where most of the other students are there sort of because of the wealth of their family. So like, let's just think first of this relationship, right? That he is there and his dad is there working at it. So like, is there any indication of that, how that impacted him? How he's like, I mean, I think you had the story in there of like how his dad told him like, all right, go and apologize.
Yeah. It's really interesting, the story of his university education. So the University of Virginia, founded in the early 19th century by Thomas Jefferson, of course, in Charlottesville. And Jefferson's desire, from his spoken desire from the beginning, was to provide scholarships and opportunities for the sons of Virginia who did not have the means and weren't born into wealth and privilege to be able to receive an education. He wanted an educated republic. That's kind of the Jeffersonian ideal. Unfortunately, Jefferson also liked to spend money so much that there wasn't any money left over for scholarships by the time he finished completing this grand university campus. And so it's really only in the 1840s, which is right at the time that John Broadus is coming of age to attend a university, that these state scholarships are available. And as we said, Broadus did not grow up in poverty. His father was a slave owner, but his father, Edmund Broadus, did suffer some financial reversals around 1840. And so he was in a position where John Broadus was going to need some financial assistance. And the way that they were able to seal the deal for him to go to the University of Virginia is his father accepted the position of steward, which is sort of like the dorm father, the dormitory father of the scholarship students, which was seen as, like, on the one hand, there's some respectability to the position because it's the venerable state institution, but on the other hand, everyone understands this is a state legislator who is becoming sort of like the RA for the
Right.
college dorm. He was making a sacrifice. He was making a significant sacrifice to serve in this position so that his son John could go to school. John Brown said, "I never forgot it." But he is cast. So what that means is, one, he is cast in with sort of the careless rich of
Mhm.
the sons of Virginia planters who are wild and rowdy and aren't going to have to lift a finger to do, to have the world for the rest of their lives. And that's not John Broadus' situation. It also means that he is living with his father. The house that they lived in once belonged to President James Monroe, and it was donated to the university. And he's living there with these other students. He's taking all his meals with his father. And so his father continues to have this shaping influence and this voice in his life as a university student. If he felt any friction about that, he certainly never voices it. He only speaks in the most reverential way about his father, but he does at times call him out, like when he has a public falling out with a fellow student or he insults someone. His father reminds him of kind of this code of not only Southern honor, but evangelical honor. There's a way that we conduct ourselves in public. We don't lose control of ourselves in front of other people. You need to go and make this right. And so he continues to have this fatherly influence on him, even in his university years.
Yeah, and before we get into the honor part, because I do want to take that in a minute in a direction that you have very interestingly illustrated in the book. But I, I also wondered a little bit about the sort of the ego of a person, right? Of like you're surrounded by all this elite that is rich enough that it can pay for education here themselves. They, as you just said, these are individuals who then don't probably ever in their life need to lift a finger to work to make an income because of the wealth they inherit. And he's sort of a bit of an odd man out in that he will have to work for the rest of his life. He doesn't have that easy richness. So it in a southern society where the elite is extremely rich, does that impact your perception of yourself a little bit?
It must. I think that Broadus would fit into the, there was a demographic study done by Daniel Hundley around 1860 of Southern society, and he had a category of the upwardly mobile middle class.
Mm-hmm.
That's where Broadus fell, and he knew that about himself. And while he would never be elite in the sense of his financial situation, he did occupy a certain culturally elite position because of his education, because of his learning, because of the positions he would go on to hold, both in the world of kind of the Southern Academy at the University of Virginia. He became a professor there, and also in the world of the Southern pulpit, the Southern church. He became this highly respected orator and preacher. And so there, even if he did not own this vast plantation, he still was able to move really in the most elite circles with some ease, it would seem, simply because of kinship networks, family connections, education, learning, just a kind of a sophistication. He knew how to live in that world. What I do think is unique about Broadus and why he was able to have such influence as a Baptist minister, educator, and so on, is he was able to live, to pull from the title of the book, between worlds.
Mm-hmm.
He was able to be this mediating figure between elite culture and popular culture, the academy, the Baptist church, north, south. He had a unique ability, I think, to be kind of an interpreter who could cross cultural lines and boundaries and function at a really high level. And I think that's the real explanation of his impact.
Yeah, let's go back to that when we talk about him getting his first pastoral work in Charlottesville, because I think there's something really interesting that you have to say there. Before going into detail, I'm just going to throw out this question to you. Would you have wanted to be at the University of Virginia either as a student or as a professor during Broadus's time?
Well, definitely not a professor at that time. It was a pretty rough place for some of the reasons we've alluded to. Most of the student body could be characterized as sort of the careless rich of the planter aristocracy. And so they're spending daddy's money, and they're free to raise hell on campus, whatever way they so choose to do that. And so throughout the early 1840s and late 1830s, there are all these notorious incidents at the university of students just getting out of control. A circus was passing through town, and a student threw a lit cigar into the lion's cage and started a fire. They would have brawls on campus. They would beat up the professors. They held professors at gunpoint. They would ride around through the quad at night on their horses, because one of Jefferson's kind of idealistic visions of this community of learning is that the professors would live on campus among the students, which seemed like a great idea for someone who wasn't having to do it. And so the professors and their families, for goodness sake, are often terrorized by these rowdy students who are not accountable to anybody. Now, one thing that begins to change that, just as Broadus is becoming a student, is one of the longtime trustees of the college. His name is J.H. Cook, C-O-C-K-E. He's very wealthy, owns a plantation, all of this. Upon Jefferson's death, Cook begins to exert a far greater influence on the culture of the university. And Cook is an evangelical. For all of his faults, he's an evangelical Christian who believes in evangelical morality, values, virtue. And he moves the University of Virginia from Jefferson's ideal of more of a secular institution, creedless institution, to an institution that's far more impacted by religious values and evangelical propriety and morality. And so he hires different sorts of professors who are very pious, as well as being learned, like Gesner Harrison, William McGuffey, who wrote the famous Readers and all of that. And the culture begins to change. Curfews are instituted, rules are put into play. And so, that change is beginning to take place. It becomes a bit of a tamer place than it was in the earliest years. And Broadus is coming in kind of at the transition point. So he is exposed to that rowdy Southern honor culture, if you want to call it that, but he is also getting the benefits of kind of the leavening of more evangelical influences as well.
Yeah, and I was thinking Frad Row, University of Georgia or University of
Very
Alabama.
much. Very much.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Crazy time.
One professor was shot and killed by a student. I mean, it was intense.
Yeah, definitely did not want to be a professor.
That's right. That's right.
So after he's done with the university, obviously he comes back as a university professor, but I really want to focus more on sort of the pastoral side, being at a Baptist church in Charlottesville. Obviously, he's challenged by kind of the dual role. He's professor at the same time that he is pastor, but you have a number of interesting things here that you talk about, and one of them is, I think we should start with the approach that he takes in the church, because that's one thing that you highlight that really makes him stand out and different.
Yeah, thanks for asking. So it's helpful to understand a little bit of the context of Baptist life in the South. Baptist by around the year 1850, which is about when Broadus moves into the pastorate at the Charlottesville Baptist Church. Baptists by the 1850s have grown exponentially, explosively from the 18th century, largely because of the benefits of the Second Great Awakening and those massive revivals that swept through the South. And so Baptists and Methodists are the fastest growing and largest Protestant denominations in the South and in the nation at that point. And they're seen very much as popular denominations. They appeal to the common man. The typical Baptist pastor, it has not received any kind of a university education. Baptists did not require any kind of formal theological training, unlike Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Episcopalians. And that's one reason why Baptists have been able to grow. They were able to move with that westward expansion onto the frontier and really keep up with westward expansion because they didn't have to send their ministers to school first. And so Baptist ministers have this reputation for just being very plain spoken, revivalistic, kind of relying on emotionalism to a certain extent and really appealing to the common man. Now, the reason why it's important to point all that out, like that's why Baptists had become what they were, but a change was happening in the antebellum South, the 1830s and 40s, as Southern towns are growing and developing, becoming more sophisticated places. Baptist churches are beginning to change in those areas as well. So Baptist churches in towns like Richmond or even a town like Charlottesville are going to have members who are now doctors or lawyers or bankers. It's not just the laboring class, if you want to use a pejorative term like that. And these Baptist churches in these towns are now wanting really more sophisticated ministers who will match the clientele and will kind of reflect their own image of themselves as more sophisticated members of society. And so what Broadus is able to do, again, I think in a unique way, is he is the picture of Southern gentility. Apart from the fabulous wealth, he is the picture of Southern gentility with his learning, his manners, his family connections, all that kind of thing. And so he's this gentleman pastor serving a town church, but he is also able to communicate with regular people. I think he never forgets that he is a Baptist, that it is essentially a popular denomination, and he takes all this learning, and he has an MA in the classics and classical languages, and yet he's able to speak in a way that is clear and accessible, winsome, conversational. One of the best ways I think to capture the uniqueness of Broadus's delivery is, there's a famous trope about the Gettysburg Address, where you have this great orator, Edward Everett, who delivers like a 2-hour, 13,000 word speech with all of these flourishes and all the things that you expect from the early 19th century. Then Abraham Lincoln steps forward and he delivered, I don't know how many words are in the Gettysburg Address, but it's just like two
like
paragraphs
or something.
Yes, and it's so simple, it's plain, it's clear, but the simple eloquence and elegance of that continues to stir us. And that marked a real change, I think, in public discourse and in oratory and what Americans thought of as true eloquence. And I think John Broadus represents that kind of commitment to clarity and simplicity, even though he's also bringing all of this classical training, if that makes sense. And I think that's the reason why he was able to appeal in a town like Charlottesville to the high and to the low, to the learned and to the unlearned. And in a university town like that, I think that it was a match made in heaven.
Yeah, and it's something that you highlight again and again in the book, that ability of his to kind of reach different constituents, if to use a political terminology here, is that it just, but at the same time, you have, I at least remember 2 or 3 passages in the book, you're noting that he is different from other Baptist pastors, that he's not like some in sort of the way he does have sort of that soft-spoken, conversational style. So just let me ask this, how would I have to imagine his sermon to go?
Yeah, so maybe setting up the contrast with Broadus would be the most helpful way to start. So to go back to Abraham Lincoln, he grew up in a primitive Baptist church in Kentucky and in Illinois. And he would later say, the kind of preaching I like to hear is the kind where the preacher looks like he's fighting bees. He's just, there's wild gesticulation. It's very emotional. It's loud, very repetitive. And that's kind of so that's one brand of Baptist preaching, very popular, revivalistic. On the other end of the spectrum, you have those who are maybe have the classic Baptist inferiority complex. They're trying to be these learned Episcopalian types, and they're making all of these allusions to classical literature, and they're using big words, and it's kind of sailing over the heads of normal people. So Broadus, I think, recognizes the drawbacks to both of those approaches. And what he does instead is he just unfolds the meaning of a passage of scripture in very clear conversational language. He had a very warm personality. He knew how to connect with people. The word that is often used of Broadus from homiletic, preaching reviewers, critics, is the word winningness. He had this ability to win over whoever he was talking to. So he seemed like he was treating you with respect and dignity. He would speak with you honestly in words that you could understand. He seemed to be able to relate to you. But he was also explaining the meaning of biblical passages. He wasn't just on a soapbox ranting. Some of the students who would come to him for training later at the seminary were coming off the frontier, and their whole sermons would consist of, they would say, just shouting the word repent, 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 repent. So John Broadus wasn't doing that. He's actually teaching you something. He's leading you to commitment to Christ, to receiving the call of the Word of God, but in a way that remained accessible to all listeners.
Yeah, and while you were talking, I actually pulled up the book real quick because I needed to remind myself. He actually wrote a book on that, right? The treatise on the preparation and delivery of sermons.
Yes.
And that's during the time when he is at the seminary that he writes this for sort of educational purposes. So like you are still at the seminary, you are having an insight into this. Do you like, is his shadow, his legacy of how, or is this book still being used by you in the school? Or is this sort of like, nah, 1860s, dusty stuff, we're not dealing with that anymore?
Yeah. So the curriculum has certainly been updated since then, and other modern contemporary books are in heavy use. But no, John Broadus's original treatment on how to prepare and deliver sermons is still held in high regard, and I think justly so. So one thing that Broadus is doing in that book is he's taking all this classical training that he has about just the art of rhetoric, the art of persuasive speech, and applying that to sermon preparation. And in a Baptist context where you often have no training at all, it's pretty revolutionary stuff, because most revivalist type preachers are going to ascribe to what some scholars have called the spontaneous delivery, spontaneous inspiration method, where you just stand up, no notes, no preparation, and what you open your mouth and you just trust the Spirit of God to give you utterance in that moment. And John Broadus believed very much in relying on the enabling power of the Holy Spirit as a preacher of God's word. But he also believed that there were things that the preacher could and should do on his end to prepare the most effective, most persuasive discourse that he could. And so he really walks preachers through the 5 classical canons of rhetoric: invention, the gathering of materials, which for a preacher would involve the study of the Bible; arrangement, how are we now going to organize all of these materials; style, elocution, what's the best word choice; all these kinds of very thoughtful considerations about how you can get your message across to your listeners in the most effective way. That really was breaking new ground in a Baptist context, to be able to wed those insights from Cicero and Aristotle and others with an evangelical commitment to Scripture and the preaching of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Again, that ability to kind of bring two worlds together is a unique contribution that Broadus makes. And so, like, I have some students who are reading that book this semester.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So curious, do you find yourself judging sometimes when you're in not your own Baptist church, but someone else's Baptist church, the pastor, when they deliver, and you're kind of like applying Broadus to them, and you're like, Broadus would have done that differently? And
Sure. So, I mean, obviously, there's nothing to critique in my sermons. They're always perfect.
exactly.
Of course. No, but seriously, on my end of things, I do think about those categories that Broadus used when preparing sermons, because I'm a pastor, I'm a preacher in addition to teaching at the seminary, and it's really very helpful. As a Christian theologian, we would call it common grace, the fact that non-Christians, like the pagan philosophers Aristotle and Cicero, just because they did not belong by faith to Jesus Christ, it doesn't mean they don't have really rich and wonderful insights. God, by His common grace, allows them to have all sorts of wisdom that we can glean from. And so, anyway, I find it very helpful myself, and certainly it is. It's always tempting, and sometimes it's my assignment if I'm teaching a preaching class to apply some of those categories to other people's sermons to kind of help make it just as clear as it can be. That's really the goal. You want to go for clarity.
Cool. Wow.
That may be more than you wanted.
No, that's I was hoping that you would still, because it sounded like he had done some really good legwork with it. So it's great that that still continued.
So Broadus is certainly wanting to elevate Baptist culture, to just speak in really broad terms. He doesn't want Baptist preachers to only be known for the kinds of sermons that look like you're fighting bees. He doesn't want them to be known for ignorance and so forth. He wants to elevate the culture, but he also he doesn't want to turn them into something that they're not. He's not trying to ape some sort of high culture, something from overseas, maybe that wouldn't fit a Southern Baptist situation. He's very realistic in that way. And so one thing that I think sets Broadus apart from others who were engaged in this enterprise of elevating Baptist culture in the 19th century is he never despised Baptist. I think there are some Baptists who live with just this inferiority complex. They're always looking over their shoulder at their Episcopalian friends, their Presbyterian friends, wanting to be accepted by them. And I don't think Broadus ever did that for when he actually had all the culture and the education. I mean, when he graduated with that MA in classics from the University of Virginia, that's about the highest degree that you could earn in the early 19th century South. So, I mean, he read in 14 different languages. He has an international correspondence with scholars. He's widely recognized as being legitimate. And so to me, he doesn't have that nervous, anxious, I've got to prove myself vibe that some of his contemporaries in the Baptist church did. But because he actually did have that learning and that training, he was able to benefit his fellow Baptists in his generation.
Yeah, well, and that's like it shows, right? But your title of the book there, between worlds, also applies, I feel like, especially during this 1850s period when he's in Charlottesville, to the other aspects that, and even in the seminary time, I should point that out too, that it's in both in the entirety of his life, I suppose, then that he's also very comfortable as a Southerner, as somebody who grew up with slavery, whose family members had slaves, that he is comfortable going to places like Philadelphia and New Jersey and talking to Northerners and having kind of conversations. And even like later when we get to the seminary, he is able to get money out of Rockefeller. So it seems like he's also in a sectional sense, as especially the crisis of sectional division is growing, is able to kind of bridge those two worlds rather well.
Yes, that's such an important part of Broadus's story. He opposed secession all the way up until secession happened, just on the eve of the Civil War. And then, of course, once South Carolina was where he was living at that time for the seminary, once South Carolina secedes and then his own native Virginia secedes, he totally throws in his lot with the Confederacy. But he was kind of this Union first Virginia Whig, like his father had been, like other Virginia Whigs at that time were. That was a common position to hold. He was never a fire eater, but he was very much committed to Southern society, Southern civilization. After the Civil War, I think one of the insights that Southern scholars of the Old South have brought out in recent days is, there's not just one brand of lost cause-ism. So Broadus is someone who very much believed in the cultural institutions of the South, including slavery, including just a general hierarchy of society where genteel, educated white men are kind of exercising this benevolent fatherly guidance over the culture, and they're responsible to kind of uplift both blacks and poor whites. All that, like, he never left that behind. He always had this class consciousness. But at the same time, he has a realism about him once the war is over, that the Old South is not coming back. Slavery is not coming back. He even reaches a point where he says, it's good that slavery was gone. I'm glad that it's gone. He's ready to move forward into the future, into a modern New South, if you will. But that doesn't mean he wants to jettison certain aspects of Southern culture that he still thinks are quite valuable. But because he had kind of this conciliatory, New South perspective, he was able to preach reconciliation across the sections. He was invited to all kinds of not only Northern Baptist gatherings, Northern evangelical gatherings, and then just Northern cultural gatherings. He was seen by Northerners, I think, as a very safe Southerner because he was unapologetically Southern. He never apologized for the South holding the positions that they did during the Civil War. He never groveled. But at the same time, he wasn't this bitter, intransigent, backward-looking, unreconstructed Southerner in that sense. And there were many. He wanted it to be a United States, right? He wanted North and South to work together. He wanted the South to modernize to a certain extent, and that made him a really attractive figure. With all that being said, he never gave up his love for the Confederacy. He never stopped wistfully reading these kind of peons to the Old South and plantation life and all that. But he was also a realist enough to say, if the Southern Baptist Convention is going to survive, if the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary is going to survive, we're going to have to adapt, and we're going to have some level of reconciliation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, and I think that's sort of an important part of your book, to kind of that bridging from old to new South, sort of the role that sort of the lost cause plays in this. And it was really fascinating in that too, that you have him eventually go into Robert E. Lee's army after the defeat of Gettysburg, and sort of the it's almost like psychological work he does for that army.
Yes, very true. So Broadus was around late 30s, 40 when the Civil War breaks out. So under normal circumstances, he could have served as a chaplain or something, but Broadus was afflicted with very poor health throughout his life. I think the most likely explanation is he had a severe case of Crohn's disease. It was a very debilitating digestive condition that he had that would force him to go to bed, to be bedridden, to stop teaching for the rest of the semester, that kind of thing. And so he was not able to serve for the duration of the war in the field, but he was invited by Stonewall Jackson to preach to the Army of Northern Virginia in 1863. Actually, he received that invitation just before Jackson's death at the Battle of Chancellorsville. And so right after that, of course, Lee leads the Army of Northern Virginia across the border, across the section, up into the Battle of, through Maryland and up to the Battle of Gettysburg. And Broadus is traveling from his home in Greenville, South Carolina, where the seminary is, into Northern Virginia to fulfill his commitment to preach to the troops right after the Battle of Gettysburg. And so he's there at the lowest point for Lee's army after this, terrible defeat for them. And he serves in the hospital wards. He's scrambling eggs and handing out coffee and doing some of these just kind of basic acts of human care and nursing. He's praying with soldiers in their final moments and so forth. But he's also, along with ministers from all denominations, including some Roman Catholics, he is holding services, prayer services, revival services, preaching messages from the Bible and calling people to respond with personal commitment to Jesus Christ. And in that context, right after defeat, when the South is just, psychologically crushed, as you said, Broadus and the other ministers with him see this tremendous mass response to their message. And like non-religious historians would call this a revival of sorts. And those took place, in various aspects on both sides of the Civil War. But this was a huge one for the Confederacy and the Army of Northern Virginia. And just, thousands of people respond. There's one Baptist minister who's a friend of Broadus named J. William Jones, who later writes a famous book called Christ in the Camp, sort of valorizing these Southern revivals. But he was holding so many baptisms of soldiers in a given day that he never even changed out of his wet clothes. He just stayed in wet clothes all day because someone else was coming forward wanting to be dunked in a public, profession of their faith. Well, Broadus is a part of all of that. And he's pleading in the state Baptist newspaper for other ministers to come and to serve and to minister because it was the fields were so white unto harvest, I would say. And so a Civil War historian like James McPherson is able to look at those revivals and say, whatever you make of them personally, there's no question that this renewed commitment to God, this renewed sense that God was with them even in their lowest moment, really enables the Confederate Army to continue fighting into 1865. It really bolsters them,
Mhm.
and I think that that's true.
Yeah, I mean, there is that. I mean, as terrible as Gods and Generals is as a film or as a book, right? There is some truth to this sort of claim that either side's cause is ordained by God, whatever we make of it.
Yeah, whatever you personally make of that and your interpretation, you can't deny the impact that religion has
Yeah.
for both sides, for the Union and the Confederate Army. Civil religion was so important in the Civil War. That's something that Nathan, or excuse me, I always say Nathan Hatch, and I mean Harry Stout. Excuse me, that's who I meant.
Yeah.
On the Altar of the
Yep.
Nation, Harry Stout has written an entire book about this,
Mhm.
and others have explored it as well. As religion had a huge shaping influence on the Civil
Yeah, and in that you also have there's sort of these arcs that you have in the book, and the Gettysburg arc ends with Broadus's funeral in many ways, and the escorts that veterans of the Confederacy provide to him.
That's right. So he is beloved as a Confederate partisan to the end of his life. There are Confederate soldiers sort of standing sentinel for him at his burial. Of course, by the end of his life, he's living in Louisville, Kentucky, which is a bit of a border town. And so there are also Northern veterans that are present at his funeral, and that was seen as kind of a testimony to his ability to bridge, a divided, broken nation. That was part of the eulogy that was given for him. But Broadus is so beloved by Confederates. I mean, there is a chapter of the Sons of Confederate Veterans meeting in Louisville named the John Broadus Camp, and so they had no illusions about where Broadus's true loyalties lay. He's an unrepentant Southerner and Confederate who nevertheless was happy that there could be a United States in the late 19th century, and was eager to move forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and at this stage, I want to move to a part that I kind of talked with you before the interview, and I said there's one thing that I would have loved for you to explore more.
Sure.
And this is the part where I want to go now, because you already mentioned that he had a lot of health issues, and he went to the spas in Virginia to kind of help with that. But you also have 2 trips to Europe and the Middle East Holy Land.
I thought you might be interested in that.
And it's like, when I read that, I was like, oh, why? You have like 2 pages on this. This is what I really like. I would have loved to hear more. Like, maybe you don't have it, but just like he is a minister. He is very committed to Christ. He's very committed to, has studied the biblical stories, and he gets to go to the place, right? Like, he goes to, I would assume, Jerusalem. He goes to Nazareth, and he gets to see and walks the places where the Savior of, in his mind, lived, died for the sins. And I was curious, what was there anything he wrote, anything that he kind of talked about was sort of the feelings that he got being in those places?
Yeah. Jesus lived, died, and rose again from that place in Jerusalem, and he was eager to go there. And so it's a really fascinating story. Broadus and the seminary on the other side of the Civil War are expectedly totally broke, desolate. Broadus and his family will go 6 months at a time without receiving a paycheck. They're buying groceries on credit. He's serving 4 different country pastorates just to make ends meet. And often they can only pay him in, say, eggs or butter or something. So it is a lean time in Greenville, South Carolina. And as you mentioned, Broadus's health is such that he can't sustain that kind of constant strain and workload. Eventually he's going to break down. And he seemed to be on the point of like total final collapse when his friend and fellow founder of the seminary, James P. Boyce, whose father was the wealthiest man in South Carolina in the 1830s. That's saying something. His name is Kerr Boyce, and he was just this fabulously wealthy financier, banker, merchant figure in South Carolina. Well, Boyce inherits all that fortune. He's really the reason why the seminary is able to keep going. He is in that upper echelon of the elites of the elites. And he and Broadus are the closest of friends. And in 1870, 71, when Broadus is on the point of total collapse, Boyce says, I'm sending you on a year-long world tour. And it just goes to show you that even though the seminary is barely scraping by, Boyce was able to maintain some of his personal wealth during this period. And he and the trustees agree that Broadus is worth so much to the institution. There's only like 4 founding faculty members, so he's worth so much to the institution that we would rather do without him for a year to be able to keep him for another 20 years or something. And so they send him on this grand tour. And that was kind of a tradition among genteel Southerners at this time. If you had the means and the culture, you would take a grand tour like this. You're kind of this leisurely person. You're going to Athens, you're going to London, you're going to the Holy Land. And a Broadus, who would never have been able to do that on his own dime, from his own resources, is able to do it through, the patronage of a wealthy friend. And that's kind of a theme throughout his life. But Broadus spends 1870 and 71 traveling the world, seeing all these sites. He's such a literary man. He's able to go to the places where Shakespeare lived and wrote. He's able to visit the pyramids in Egypt. He sees Corfu. He goes to Jerusalem. He goes to he has all the he goes to the Louvre. He hears a presentation of Bach in Germany and Mozart, and he loves it. I mean, it's just a feast for a cultured Southerner like him. It is an absolute feast for the intellect and for the senses. And almost no Southern Baptist at that time would ever get an opportunity like that. And he's able to record so much of what he's seeing and experiencing in articles, like correspondence articles that he sends back to the Religious Herald, the state Baptist paper of Virginia. And it just contributes to kind of the broadening of Broadus's outlook and the cultural sophistication, and also just the aura of sophistication that he held among Southern Baptists. Like I said, nobody else got to do stuff like that. But he's attending Greek Orthodox services and just doing things that a provincial Southerner could not even dream about. And he's able to bring a lot of those resources back. Now, like you said, I was limited with my pages of how much time I could document that. But if you want just kind of a blow by blow account of what he saw and did, that Life and Letters book by A.T. Roberts and his son-in-law, it's on Google Books, it's free. You can read letter after letter of Broadus and his experiences, talking about what he sees there.
Cool. I might have to check that out. That's
yeah.
Just kind of it's fascinating when you kind of get the person to go to the place where something really important for them personally takes place.
Yeah. So one artifact remained really important in Southern Baptist life from that journey. When Broadus returns to the States, James P. Boyce, his friend, the co-founder of the seminary, he is serving at that time as the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, which means there's an annual meeting that has to be called to order and so forth. And Broadus presents to his friend at that annual meeting a mallet that's made from the olive wood from Jerusalem, and it becomes known as the Broadus gavel, and it is used by every president of the Southern Baptist Convention to open that meeting for 150 years or something along those lines. It's finally retired in 2021 out of concerns for some of those connections with slavery and so forth that Boyce and Broadus both had. But for a really, really long time, Broadus's name was invoked at the beginning of every Southern Baptist Convention annual meeting.
Wow. Talk about a long shadow.
That's right.
So we have the seminary has been in our background now for pretty much the entire hour we've been talking. So it's time we actually talk about that seminary a little bit.
Great.
And you you already pointed out that we have two locations for it. You have it first in South Carolina, and then it moves to Kentucky. So just run us through, like, very briefly of, like, why started in South Carolina and then why move it eventually to Kentucky.
Well, I mentioned earlier this transition that Southern Baptist culture is experiencing in the 1830s and 40s, where this very grassroots popular denomination is becoming a little more sophisticated in the towns and the cities of the South. And among those town Baptist preachers and leaders, there's a desire to provide training
Mhm.
for Baptist preachers. And the rub though for Baptist is we can't forget that most of our constituency is not the sophisticated city type. So we don't want to create an institution that's going to form this elitist cadre of preachers who can't actually communicate with fellow Baptists. And so it has to be a unique brand of seminary. And that's what James P. Boyce and Broadus and some of their friends were able to create. It's a seminary that is on the one, there are kind of three main points to the founding. One, it's got to be accessible to every Baptist who believes he's been called by God to preach the gospel. So whether he has the most exquisite graduate training or he has no training, we want him to be able to come. And so that's why they offered classes in the English Bible, not just in the Greek and the Hebrew, but they wanted to make it accessible. They offered an elective system so that you could kind of pick and choose the classes that you thought would help you the most in your ministry. So they want to be accessible, but they also wanted it to be academically rigorous, meaning let's offer at least a track for the more advanced students who are going to go on to Bible translation, scholarship, professorships, leadership in the denomination. We don't want Baptists who are inclined to that level of rigor to have to go to Paedo-Baptist, infant baptizing traditions among the Presbyterians and so forth. So we want it accessible, but we also want an academic track, and it needs to be bound by a confession of faith, which is not something that is universal among Baptists, this appreciation for creeds and confessions. But Boyce and the founders believed that the faculty of the institution needed to be accountable to a conservative theological statement of faith. Anyway, they create this innovative Baptist seminary, kind of in a way the first of its kind, in Greenville, South Carolina, because that's where most of the financial support was. James P. Boyce is a South Carolinian. South Carolina Baptists were willing to contribute the lion's share of the resources. Greenville, South Carolina was already a bit of a hub for Baptist thought life. Furman University is located in Greenville. There's some other important institutions there. And so the seminary from 1859 in its founding to 1877 is functioning in Greenville, South Carolina. The reason they ultimately leave in 1877 is because it's hard to think of a more depressed area in Reconstruction than Greenville, South Carolina. That's not really where you want to be. I mean, so much of the war had blown through South Carolina. It was totally impoverished. They were very much just in the throes of all the tumult surrounding Reconstruction governments. There's lots of racial violence and unrest there. And Boyce and Broadus both reached the conclusion, if the seminary is going to survive, we need to relocate to a more prosperous New South city where we're going to have a reliable donor base. And so Memphis was in contention, Chattanooga was in contention, but possibly in Atlanta. Ultimately, they settle in Louisville, Kentucky. Kentucky Baptist, obviously that's a border state, so not quite as devastated by the Civil War as some of the lower southern states. There's a ton of Baptists in Kentucky, a lot of rich Baptists in Kentucky. And Louisville is actually very central to the contiguous United. I mean, you're about as close to Canada as you are to New Orleans in Louisville. And in fact, some diehard unreconstructed Southern Baptists were concerned that it was going to become more of just an American Baptist seminary, not specifically Southern. But they really believed that Louisville, this kind of up and coming New South railroad town, that's where we want to be. And so they relocated there in 1877 and really went on to flourish in the 1880s. But those 15 years or so right after the Civil War, from 1865 to 1880, those were lean years for Broadus and the rest of the faculty.
Yeah. Just again, out of curiosity, you are still in Louisville. You're still the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Is it like more national these days than,
Oh,
or
it's
is your
very
student body still
international at this
international?
point. So, I'm very biased. I love this institution. I'm very grateful to teach here. So I think it's wonderful, but I'm not alone in that. It's really internationally recognized as just a bellwether of conservative evangelical and Baptist training for ministry and for scholarship. And so, I mean, I have students from South Korea and from Africa, from all over the world, both online and on campus. And so it very much has an international flavor. It's not just a provincial Southern institution, although certainly those Southern roots are still there. I hope in all the best ways. I think that the institution has really tried to grapple with, honestly, some of the less attractive elements of that Southern past, while preserving some of the best.
Yeah. All right. Good. So the worries did not come true. And
That's right.
You sort of, I'm segueing us towards Crawford Toy, but one of the things that you already talked about, sort of that he is exposed during his trip to Europe to some of the German culture, but the seminary is also changing during this time, and it is very common for people at this point to kind of look at German universities and how German universities structure education, and kind of some of that comes over, right? Johns Hopkins University will eventually create sort of that first PhD program modeled after German PhD programs, but in general, sort of seminars coming over. So how much does sort of the Atlantic interchange of ideas about higher education influence the way the seminary is structured?
Great question. John Broadus totally idealized German scholarship, German university, research universities. He always saw Germany as the gold standard for deep scholarship and academic rigor. He said that he read in German every day. I mean, because that's
Oh my God, I still feel sorry for him now.
well, that's where the cutting edge scholarship was taking place. Now, I didn't always agree with what they were saying, but he wanted to keep abreast of that. He's a New Testament scholar. I mean, he's a Greek New Testament scholar. That's really what his deepest love was. And he wrote a well-received commentary on Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew. And so if he's going to be a legitimate contributor to the current conversation about biblical studies, you've got to be swimming in those German waters. And when Broadus is the one who designed the curriculum for the seminary, and he drew from the elective model of the University of Virginia, but he's also drawing heavily from German university ideas. And he regularly recommended to his best students, when they were finished at the seminary, to go complete their studies in Germany. Now Broadus was aware that this is the time of the rise of the modern scientific worldview. There's increasing skepticism about the authority of the Bible, the reliability of the Bible, the inspiration of the Bible. In many German institutions, University of Berlin and Leipzig and other places, the Bible's, all a priori assumptions about the Bible being the Word of God, some kind of transcendent narrative, all that's being pushed aside. It's just being studied like any ancient Near Eastern document. What are the historical influences, the cultural influences? And Broadus was aware of that to a certain extent, so that he would tell his students, don't lose your faith when you go over there. Go and plunder whatever learning and wisdom and rigor that you can from the Germans, and then come back, as he would say, in the fullness of the blessing of Christ. Really, the model for that is a man named Charles Hodge, well known stalwart defender of Protestant orthodoxy at Princeton Seminary throughout the 19th century. So he did his studies in Germany, and then he came back and was like the arch conservative of American Protestantism. And I think that's kind of what Broadus wanted for the top tier Southern Baptist scholars like Crawford Toy. It's like a younger brother to him. He had been in his church in Charlottesville. He'd been his student at the University of Virginia. He became a student at the seminary. And he said, and I mean, Crawford Toy is someone who's like reading in Ugaritic while he's marching with the infantry in the Civil War. I mean, this guy's a walking brain. And John Broadus says, you've got to go to the German universities. And so Toy does. And he comes back and he joins the faculty at the seminary, and he's the jewel of the faculty. He's kind of the pride of Southern Baptist scholarship. And it looks like he's going to follow the path of Charles Hodge, meaning I took the best that Germany had to offer, but I kept my skirts clean of any destructive criticism of the Bible. But as it turned out, no, he got infected by that German germ. And Toy, while he's teaching in the classroom, is privately just ransacking textbooks about geology and Charles Lyell and Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, and he's really reaching a lot of those same conclusions that would become associated with Protestant liberalism. And so, as you know, Protestant liberalism was an attempt at forging kind of a third way. So you've got the old time orthodoxy, which is seen as no longer serviceable to the modern mind. And then you have the complete, naturalistic worldview that jettisons any belief in God, an atheistic worldview, essentially. Protestant liberals are trying to find this third way between the two of them that retains the enduring spiritual message of the Bible, while appealing to the modern contemporary mind, making allowances for new historical discoveries and scientific discoveries and so forth. And so that's essentially what Toy pioneers in Southern Baptist life. We can study the Bible as rigorous scholars and apply all these higher critical sort of methods to it, like we learned in Germany, but we can still maintain our piety and our commitment to God. Well, that placed him outside the bounds of Southern Baptist orthodoxy. And really the most painful episode of John Broadus's life is when he has to encourage Toy to submit his resignation to the trustees, because he's now transgressed that founding confessional document that I mentioned earlier. And Broadus leaves it up to the trustees. He says, look, if they give you a passing grade and you can stay, great. But I think you've moved too far from where we thought you were for us to not bring this out into the open. And ultimately, Toy is dismissed. He becomes, I think I've got this right, he's the first theological professor dismissed for the new theology in America. I'm almost sure that Charles Briggs says that at the end of the 19th century. He's certainly at the very beginning stages of that. He goes on to this celebrated career at Harvard, ancient Mesopotamian studies and that kind of thing. But that really becomes a watershed moment for Broadus and Southern Baptists. For the Southern Baptists who, like Broadus, wanted to elevate Southern Baptist culture and scholarship, they realize, there's a bridge too far that we're not going to be able to travel. And I think Broadus spends the last 15 years or so of his life trying to forge this path of conservative scholarship, where he's doing rigorous work that's widely respected far beyond Southern Baptist boundaries, but that is nevertheless committed to an orthodox view of the Bible as the Word of God.
Yeah, I mean, it is an interesting period when we think of sort of biblical studies in general, right? That sort of search for the historical Jesus, as it's sort of termed, and it is a challenging period for religious individuals in general to kind of in this new age of archaeology, of searching in the grounds in the Middle East for the evidence of the historical figure. I can see where it's hard to reconcile the faith with maybe the evidence that come out.
Well, so to John Broadus's horror, many of the students who he commended a sojourn in Germany to are coming back with these higher critical views of the Bible. So it's like he's the one who opened the door to Germany, and now
Right.
he's desperately trying to close it.
Yeah.
And so he now becomes kind of this father figure to this rising generation of Baptist preachers and scholars, trying to shepherd them away from destructive critical views of the Bible, but still towards serious scholarship. And so he's such a mentor figure to so many. But for instance, William Rainey Harper, who becomes the famous founding president of the University of Chicago, which is like the headquarters of modernism, a modernistic study of the Bible in the early 20th century. Harper loves him. Broadus loves Harper, but Broadus can't keep Harper from crossing lines that he doesn't want him to cross about scriptures. Someone who did listen to Broadus was someone named A.T. Robertson. Mentioned him several times. He writes the very famous and just universally renowned Greek grammar of the New Testament. He also becomes Broadus's son-in-law, but he's someone who's trying to do scholarship at a really high level and is actually received by the academy while maintaining this deep commitment to conservative evangelical Christianity. Robertson is probably the last of his breed in some ways, someone who is able to function in the academy while maintaining old school Orthodox Christianity, basically. And that's really what Broadus wanted to hold on to. And I think he could feel it sort of slipping away from him at the end of his life.
So this, I think I know the answer, but out of curiosity, how's the feeling today about in the student body, faculty about Crawford Toy?
Yeah, I mean, he's seen as a cautionary tale, no doubt. He's seen as someone who lost his moorings and lost his faith. You know, there's a verse in 1 Corinthians 13 in the New Testament that says, actually 1 Corinthians 8, excuse me, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. And so I think there's an awareness on a seminary campus that anytime you're engaged in learning, there's a danger of becoming puffed up, becoming prideful, of thinking maybe you are more sophisticated than the Word of God, to the point that you're not willing to humble yourself under it. And so Toy is seen as kind of a tragic figure, honestly. And perhaps we don't always make the effort to understand him as thoroughly as we ought to. I tried to do that in my chapter. But certainly the Broadus model is what is held up as the standard.
All right, good. So since you have an engagement in a few minutes, as a final question, I was curious, what was sort of maybe the most fun section to write, or the most interesting parts that you didn't expect to find when you wrote the book? What sort of was the moment where you were like just blown away that this was so amazing to see or hear or share with the audience? So
Yeah, what draws me to pursuing history through biography so much is the human element. And I think moving from seeing Broadus as kind of this oil portrait figure on the wall of the seminary to a real human being who really accomplished some remarkable things in his life, but was also capable of great foolishness and frailties and foibles like any other human being. And I think it's really Broadus's family life and his titanic struggle to hold together his ambition to do something great and to make the most of his life and to maximize the platform that he believed God had given to him and gifted him for, while at the same time remaining appropriately humble before God and before God's people, and also remaining committed to his family. Now, one thing we've not really explored is how Broadus's ambition to be great and also his commitment to keep the seminary alive during Reconstruction required him to be gone all the time and to work all the time, work himself to the point of exhaustion, fundraise all over the United States and keep all these speaking engagements. And he's someone who really loved his family, I think, and wanted to be there for him. He grew up in a very warm, devoted family environment. And he often feels this inner pang that he's leaving his wife and his children alone again. And just the way that he tried to balance all that. So I think coming to see Broadus as a much more relatable human figure, that was a lot of fun for me. And as I said, I'm also trying to, prosecute this chronological march through American history, through Baptist biographies. And so I just learned so much about the antebellum period, Civil War, Reconstruction, Gilded Age. That's one reason why I like to write these, was just the joy of learning. And I learned so much through it. And I'm grateful to God for the opportunity.
Yeah, and that's a great end to our conversation, I think, to kind of think in that learnings that we always engage in various ways. So, and I think we left a lot still on the table for people that want to read your book, since we kind of scratched the surface with a few really interesting episodes here. So, for the listeners who are interested, it is Between Worlds, John A. Broadus, the Southern Baptist Seminary, and the Prospects of the New South by Eric Smith, LSU Press, published. Thank you so much, Eric.
Thank you. It has been my sincere pleasure. I want to thank you for the time that you've invested in reading and then talking with me about my book. I'm so grateful.
My pleasure.